Hello, and welcome to the Freelancer's Guide to Arnold for Maya. My name's Timothy Hansen. I'm a freelance CG supervisor and 3D generalist based here in sunny Los Angeles, California, and I'm going to be guiding you through this crash course on the ever-popular and amazingly powerful Arnold renderer from SolidAngle. Whether you're a freelancer starting a new job or a seasoned artist whose facility has decided to change their primary rendering engine, either way, you're going to need to hit the ground running, and this video is created to be your quick start guide to rendering in Arnold, and I'm confident we're going to get you rendering here on day one. So as we get started, just telling you a little bit about this scene. It's amazingly simple. It's a three light setup, essentially, and skydome light and 2 area lights, and that's it. The GI in Arnold is amazingly fast and efficient. It's very easy to clean up noise and get a beautiful image, but it is very particular in the way that it calculates rays, and if you're not careful, your render times can go through the roof, and we're going to try and address those sorts of things and get you in a healthy setting range for your samples. So the first thing we need to do is let's take a look at the render globals. So here we are out of the box. I will quickly go through all of our tabs here. So your common is essentially the same as mental ray, V-ray, anything you have. Then the next tab is your Arnold renderer tab. And this is the heart and soul of Arnold right here in the sampling. So going down the line, there's camera samples, diffuse, glossy, refraction, subsurface, and volume indirect. Now your camera samples are a global multiplier of everything below it. Diffuse is essentially your GI, glossy covers your speck and reflection, refraction, self-explanatory, is glass and things of that nature, subsurface, and volume indirect covers things like your Maya fluids, volume fluids, fume effects, things of that nature. And like I said, the math that happens here is the single most important thing you need to understand before moving forward. And now how this works is your camera samples, like I said, are a global multiplier of everything underneath it. Think of your camera samples as your overall anti-aliasing quality. The math you need to understand is 3 is not just, okay, I have 3 camera samples, because if you notice up here it says 9, and why does it say 9 here if it's 3 here, and why does this say 225 when there's a value of 5 here? And the reason that these numbers differ from these numbers is because this number equals this number multiplied by itself and then multiplied by the diffuse times itself, glossy times itself. So what I mean by that is the way that the calculation goes is 3 times 3 equals 9, and then 5 times 5, 25. 25 times 9 equals 225. Now, I'm sure that might be a little bit confusing, but it all adds up. So actually, let's do this. Let's go ahead and show you. So, camera samples times itself multiplied by all of these values times themselves. So, 3 squared is 9 times 5 squared is 225. And then that matches our calculator here. Okay, so once you have that math down, then you can start to manipulate these values to increase the quality of your renders. And now something to keep in mind is the camera samples are most important when it comes to things like motion blur and depth of field. You could jack these diffuse, glossy, refraction, you could send these rays through the roof, and it's not going to clean up a messy motion blur. The only thing that's going to clean that up is camera samples. So if you pay attention here to this calculator, let's say that we know that a value of 8 camera samples is the only thing that's going to clear up the quality of our motion blur. But now if we move this up, that 225 turns into 1,600 ray samples, and that's ridiculously high. There's almost no scenario, unless you're working in 4K, that you're going to need your samples to be that high. So as you increase your camera samples, you have to be mindful to decrease these samples underneath it to have a corresponding value that's a little bit more realistic. So let's go back really quick to a camera samples of 3, and let's say, for sake of argument, that we know that a value of 225 will give us clean diffuse, clean reflections and spec. We know that this is the number that is our minimum to have the quality that we desire. Now, as we take this up to, say, a value of 8, and then we've got 1,600 here, we need to walk these back and get them as close to that 225 number as we can. And you'll see that a value of 2 is probably where we're going to want to be. Now, if you take this down to 1, that's going to drop down to 64, and as we said, if we know as a baseline that that 225 samples was what we needed to have it be a clean render, if we drop down to 64, we're going to start introducing noise into our scene. So even though, if we move this up to 2, that 256 is more than the 225 that we know is our baseline, those extra rays are only going to increase the quality of your scene. Having a few extra rays more is always going to be more beneficial than having less rays than what you need, because the less rays, the more noise you introduce. So recapping that again, if you need to increase your camera samples, you need to adjust back, you need to walk back your diffuse, glossy, and refraction. And also a tip that is easy to overlook is our light samples are also multiplied by the camera AA. So say you have an area light with samples of 3. If we know that samples of 3 at, say, a camera AA of 3, that this looks nice, if we take this up to 8, we can also walk back this value at least 1. And that will help shave off a little bit of render time, and it's mainly a scene optimization thing. You don't have to do that, but if you're stuck for time and you're trying to shave off as much time as you can, that's a little tip as well that may not be obvious, is that the camera samples also multiply the samples on your per light object. So walk it back. Camera samples go up, walk the other things back. Now, if you don't have motion blur and things of that nature in your scene, you want to stay down in around the 3 to 4 camera samples, and then increase your corresponding glossy, diffuse, things like that, and get those numbers up that way, because the camera AA is essentially just a global multiplier. It's not a specific thing for anything other than motion blur and depth of field. If you know that you have noise in your GI, or you have noise in your spec channel, you need to pump these values up. Now, if your diffuse, your GI samples are fine at a value of 3, then leave them at 3. But if you know you've got bad noise in your glossy is the one that you're going to want to walk up. Okay? And so I know I'm spending a little bit of time on this, but this is the most important thing that you need to know about Arnold, is understanding the way that these numbers interact with each other, and just how you can find that sweet spot where you've reduced the noise to an acceptable level. So for our look dev purposes, we're going to walk these numbers back tremendously, because we don't need super sexy production level when we're just doing IPRs. So now let's move on to the next section, which is our ray depth. And now this is important in terms of, this is how our GI is driven. For sake of example, one diffuse bounce is essentially light coming in, hitting an object, and bouncing once. Increasing this, I usually default to a diffuse ray depth of 3 to 4, and that will get me, 1 bounce, 2 bounce, 3 bounce, 4 bounce, and just really send that light through the scene, filling in those deep, dark corners, nooks and crannies that will, sell that scene, give it a little bit more realism, because in the real world, back in those corners, it's not, 100% black. If there's light in a room, there's light in that corner. And the way that you introduce that light into the scene is by increasing your diffuse ray depth bounces. And as we go down the line, it's pretty self-explanatory. Glossy, if you have reflective objects in your scene, you have to have a minimum of 1. Usually you can get away with a value of 2. Reflection, refraction, same thing. You need that minimum of 2 to get light to go through that glass and come back through that glass. And the same thing for transparency depth. Say you had, pane of glass, pane of glass, pane of glass, pane of glass. You had 4 panes of glass. If you only had, say, 3 transparency depths, it will go through the first pane, the second pane, the third pane, but the light will not pass through the fourth, and your fourth plane will register as black. And so if you have a high number of glass objects in front of each other, you need to make sure that you have enough transparency depth so that your light rays can get all the way through all those objects. All right, so moving on, environment tab. This is where we will introduce things like skydome, reflective sky shaders. Sky shaders are what you're going to need if you want to see your HDR in reflections and refractions and literally in your scene. You're going to want to create a sky shader, but we're going to cover those things. Atmosphere, this is where you get your fog, your volume scattering, essentially volume scattering, that's your God rays, things of that nature. Motion blur, again, this is where you enable that. Lights and gamma correction. Now, this is a hot button issue, but it's very simple. Arnold essentially comes out of the box fully linearized and gamma corrected. You literally don't need to do anything. Stay at 2.2 across the board, or depending upon what your company's baseline setups are. I know at MPC they default this display driver gamma to 1. In order to see your renders linearly with that value set to 1, you need to come to display options, color management, and make sure that image color profile is set to linear sRGB and display color profile is sRGB. So again, the two options you have is leaving all these at 2.2 and having display driver gamma set to 1. If this is set to 1, you have to have linear sRGB clicked, or set that to sRGB, put this to 2.2, and either way, it's 6 to 1, half dozen the other. They're both linear. Okay? So, finishing out texture tab. Use existing .tx textures is going to be very important. That's going to come up down the line. So we'll go ahead and tick that here, and then I'll explain later why that's important. System, now this is where your IPR values come in. -3 starts at a low quality to get it just generating fast. You can set that to 2, maybe -2, -1, so that it doesn't have to sift through as many iterations in the IPR before you start to see a clean, clear image. But this is fine, essentially out of the gate. Here, render settings, you can set how you want your buckets to render, spiral, left to right, up and down. You can just leave that to default. Now this is something that's important. Bucket size, I always set this to 32. That way, as your scene is rendering, no one bucket is stuck on one core. That'll happen sometimes. You'll have a render that's going, and then you have all these other cores that could be chugging on this one swatch, this section here, but because your bucket size was set too large, one core is stuck chugging on one chunk, it's just good to set this to 32. Auto detect threads, you can leave this checked on, or if you turn it off, set your threads to what the machine that you're working on can handle. Now this particular machine that I'm on has 32 threads, so if you uncheck this, you would set that to 32 or 24 or 12, whatever your machine can handle. Okay, and moving on, AOVs, we'll cover this later. This is essentially your render passes. Diagnostics, this is important. The best thing to do is go ahead and set this to debug, tell it to create a file. Max warnings, you can set that to something like 25 or 50. I usually go with 50, and then set the path. And what this will do is every time you render, Arnold will kick out a log with detailed information that will help you debug all your renders. And overrides, but those are not necessarily important to what we're going to be doing today. So that's it. Those are all the tabs covered. And let's go ahead and just start rendering. So if I hit IPR, the first thing you're going to see is nothing because technically there are no lights in this scene. So the first thing we need to do is come up to the Arnold tab and go to Lights, Skydome Light. Okay, and now we're introducing some light into our scene. You can't see it from this angle, but there are some skylights in the ceiling, and that's how we're getting this illumination to come in. Alright, so let's just go ahead and go down the line here. Take a look at the skydome light. You have color, intensity, resolution. Color is going to be, you can either set color temperature and have a Kelvin temperature drive the illumination from the skydome light, or you can use an HDR, which is what we're going to do now. And it's going to be a 3K, and that'll be important here in just a second. So here in resolution, I know that this map that I'm using is a 3K image, so we need to set this value along the X to 3000. We don't need to worry about color temperature because the color is being derived from our HDR. Most HDRs are lat long, but if you have a mirrored ball, things of that nature, this is where you would account for that. Now, exposure and samples are essentially the two most important things when it comes to your light. So you will see as I increase the samples, let's go ahead and set this to 3, that will even out and give a cleaner GI contribution from that HDR light. And now exposure, this is the important one. Never use intensity to increase the amount of light in your scene. You want to use always exposure. And so this is just a more professional method. You could be on a project and people will be asking you to come up a stop a light, come down half a stop a light. This is where the exposure value comes into handy because it's a more realistic, real-world value than just an arbitrary intensity. So if I say increase this by a factor of 2, you'll see that the amount of illumination in our scene has effectively doubled. Okay, so moving on down the line, in our skydome, cast shadows always has to be on, very important. Now this next section is an easy way to shave, maybe a couple of seconds off your render. If you're not using any Maya fluids or fume effects in your scene, if you're not using volume scatter from your environment, essentially this is irrelevant. So I'll set this down to 0, and I'll uncheck Affect Volumetrics and Cast Volumetric Shadows. If it's not in your scene, it's a waste of computation. so turn it off. And down the line, that's pretty much it. So on your skydome light, attach your HDR through the color channel. Never mess with intensity. Set your resolution to the resolution of the map that you're using. Just 3000 in this case. Color temperature is irrelevant if you're using an HDRI image. Lat long, exposure, samples, cast shadows, and you can turn these off if you don't have volume. Okay, so now we need to get light coming in through these windows and then down in through the skylight. So let's add an Arnold area light. And if I come out to my perspective view, you'll see first off, here's our HDR, our skydome. And then here is our created area light. Now, the area lights have all essentially the same functionality as that skydome light. It's just laid out a little bit different. Color, you can map a color into the light. Intensity, same thing, don't mess with it. Exposure, this is where you're going to increase and decrease the intensity of your light. Color temperature, Kelvin temperature, this is always useful. I primarily use this always instead of trying to do a color picker. Now, decay type, always leave it to quadratic because we're trying to be physically based. Now, light shape, there are a various number of shapes that your area light can take. There's a cylinder, which you can increase, decrease in size. Think like halogen ceiling lights, things like that, neon, this can be useful to use this shape. Disc, a light of a circular nature. And then quad is your standard, area light that we all know and love. Now I'm going to go ahead and increase the size of this light. Look through it. Okay, now here I have it placed looking through the windows, and I've adjusted some of the settings. I know that this exposure value of 7 is where I need to be. I used a Kelvin temperature of about 5800 and increased my resolution to 1024. And samples, I have that set to about 2. Now, this is an important thing, normalize. Now, what normalize does, think about that light. Let me go back to the perspective view here. Let me find that light. Okay, so here's our area light. Now, out of the box, with normalize on, you could scale this light to be enormous, and no matter how large you scale this area light, it will have the same light intensity. Now, taking normalize off is essentially the size of that light then becomes a multiplier for the exposure, the intensity. So the larger you make this light with normalize off, the more light intensity is going to be coming out of this light. And so usually with your area lights, things of this nature, you always have normalize off. Really the only thing I leave normalize on for is the skydome lights. Okay, so that's basically area lights in a nutshell. Color, exposure, color temperature if you want a Kelvin value, quad if you want your standard area light, disc or cylinder are the other options, your samples, and normalize. Those are all the relevant values to get you going for your lights. So now let me create one additional light. Which I have in my scene, and it is going to be shining down in through this skylight. And you'll see with this one I used a disc shape for the area light. I just wanted a different fall off than what I would get from another square area light. So if we head back into our scene and hit IPR, give this a moment, you'll see now we're getting all that light coming in through the skylight in addition to our HDR dome light. But we're not getting any illumination coming from that second area light that sits right outside this window. And the reason for that is we need to play with the shader on this glass and give it the transparent nature that it needs to have in order to allow that light to shine through. So let's do that first. So select your glass object, assign new material, Arnold, and AI standard. Now this shader is going to be used for 90% of anything you'll ever do in Arnold. There are additional shaders. If I go back, there is the AI ambient occlusion, AI hair, ray switch, shadow catcher, skin, skin subsurface, AI standard, AI utility, and AI wireframe. Now all of these have their uses, and I'll quickly gloss over them, but essentially, like I said, AI standard is going to be your go-to for nearly everything. It's the same as MI Material X for Mental Ray, or the V material for V-Ray. This is your go-to guy for the majority of things you'll need to use. So, setting up glass. Out of the gate, for glass, you're going to take your diffuse color and you're going to set that down to black. And then you're going to roll down and come and undo the reflection and also release the refraction. Now, the index of refraction for glass is 1.4 to 1.8 roughly. I'm going to be using 1.8 in this video. And so you're going to set the refraction weight to 1. No roughness. Fresnel uses IOR. And then we're going to turn on reflection with Fresnel and specular also with Fresnel. And so if I go back to my IPR, you'll see that we're getting reflections, but we're still not seeing through the material. And now, why is that? Now, your first impulse might be to come down to the refraction tab and look at this opacity value. So let's say if we move that down, again, you'll see nothing's changing. Well, how can that be? How can I have a fully transparent object and still it's opaque? Well, that's the operative word, and that is one of the biggest catches that there is in Arnold. On the object itself, on all objects, there is an Arnold tab. And if you look right here, there's something with a tick box called opaque. All transparent medium, glass, refractive, things like that, you have to uncheck opaque before you can see through it. So if I go ahead and do that, boom, there we go. Now all of our illumination is coming through the glass. The glass is allowing it through. Okay? Let's go back to that material. And I'm going to make a couple of changes, and we're going to attach the glass material that I know to be the glass that I used in the beauty. Okay, so now I have the final glass shader attached, and you'll notice just the only thing that's different is there's a slight bit of roughness in the spec, just to give it a little bit of a breakup, so that it catches a little bit of extra light as it goes through, and it's not just a complete empty space. Otherwise you would just have no glass and let it fly through. Now, I mentioned before a sky shader. That's going to be the next thing that we're going to attach so that we can see our environment of that HDR through the glass, and also to have the environment of our HDR cast reflections and refractions. And to activate that, come back to our render settings and come down to environment and do create sky shader. And here you see I have the sky shader in the scene. And now into the color channel, I've pumped the exact same HDR that we used for our skydome light. Okay? And I've decreased the intensity down to 0.2 just because I know for my final render that was the value that looked the best. So if I put that up to 1, you'll see it's a bit blown out. So for my taste for this scene, a value of 0.2 gets me what I need. Now we're moving along pretty fast through this scene, but let me stop just for a second and cover these Arnold tabs. Now every single thing in Maya will have an Arnold tab for it. All lights, directional lights, your traditional Maya point light, spotlight, all those things, if you create one of those, they will have an Arnold tab, just as every bit of geometry has an Arnold tab. And now what's important in that Arnold tab is, again, opaque, turning that off in order to get glass see-through objects. The next section that's important is this subdivision and displacement attributes. Subdivision in Arnold, the way you want to handle that is, say back in the mental ray days, you'd have this object, okay, I want to subdivide it, I want to smooth it, you'd hit 3 or attach a mental ray subdivision approximation. But now what you want to do is set the subdivision type to Cat-Clark and then set iterations to 3. And essentially Cat-Clark with iterations of 3 is the exact same thing as selecting an object and hitting the 3 key, or adding a subdivision approximation in mental ray, or using subdivide geometry with the value of 3 in V-Ray. Okay, so I know that these curtains I want to have subdivision, so they're all set with Cat-Clark and a value of 3. And now if we had displacement, you would cover those things here, but since we don't have displacement in this scene, I'm going to skip over that, and you can watch one of our other videos setting up multi-tile UV shader networks in Arnold for Maya, and we cover all of these things, subdivision, displacement, setting up displacement shaders, so on and so forth. But because I was using it to use the opaque value for glass, I just wanted to do a quick rundown of what the Arnold tabs are. So for again, recapping, for every object and every instance of an object in Maya, there will be a corresponding Arnold tab that has relevant information. Okay, so now we have our skydome set up, our sky shader set up so that we can see our skydome. Another thing that's very important is the rotation of your sky shader must match the rotation value of your skydome light. Otherwise, say you're looking through this scene, we've got a nice bright blue sky here that would be sending in light. If this was rotated differently and this building was right here, it would be blocking the light. And so we see sky, but if our sky dome is at a different rotational value, the light coming through the window will not match what it should be. So just keep in mind, your AI sky shader must always have a rotational value that matches your sky dome light shape. Okay, so now let's start talking shaders for the objects in the scene, because we have essentially our light worked out. Now, quickly going back, as I said before, GI bounces, these corners are a little darker than I need them to be. I'm going to set this diffuse value to 4, and you'll see that the light will bounce around a little bit extra in the scene, and some of those dark corners will get filled in with an extra little kick of light. Now, as light comes through this window and it hits these curtains, there would be a hotter bright spot where the light is actually hitting it and darker where the light is not, essentially a translucency to the curtains themselves. And let's start talking about that and address that in an AI standard shader. So I am going to attach this shader that I've created previously called blinds, and you'll see in our render that light is passing through the blinds, accumulating and illuminating the spots where it is just glass to blind into room, and it's darker where the wall is occluding the light from outside the window. And now how do we achieve this look? Well, in the shader for the blinds, this translucent illumination effect is covered with backlighting. Now by default, backlighting is set to 0. And as our IPR refreshes, you'll see that they've become opaque again. But as we increase this value, I know 0.7 is what worked for me, we get that light accumulation in the fabric of these blinds. So now moving down, give it a touch of roughness so that the light scatters through the blinds a little bit more. Spec is unnecessary, reflection is unnecessary, and we don't need any refractive qualities. It's basically just a standard AI shader with a bit of backlighting. Okay, let's move on to the floor. Now the floor is just a standard, again, AI material with a color map attached to the color value, which is our floor. And then also in our bump mapping, we have a bump that corresponds to the grain of the wood, and you attach that here. So your bump maps you'll attach under the bump mapping section. I've played with repeat just to get the wood panel, size that I like. That just happened to be a repeat of 5 and 5. Okay, and now in the bump node, it's the same as any other bump node. Your bump value, this is where you pump in your bump node, the image, and then bump depth for me, with a value of 0.25 gives me the results that I'm looking for. Okay, and now going back to the shader itself, we have a bit of spec, 0.094, and a bit of roughness to get it to fall off and spread across the floor the way we want. Pretty much for all objects that have specular, refractive, or reflective qualities, for a physically based real-world render, you always have to have Fresnel checked, and then you can bring back light onto the face of the object by increasing reflectance at normal. But that's something that we can cover in another tutorial. It's not relevant to anything really in this scene. But we know that on this shader, spec of 0.094, a bit of roughness to spread it out is what we're looking for. Again, a little bit of reflection with Fresnel, and that's basically it. So our floor has a standard AI shader with a color map attached to the color value, a bump map attached to the bump, and a bit of spec and reflection. Now let's move on to the walls. Okay, and for this shader, I went for sort of a wine red color. And if you scroll up to the top, Just did a color picker of a value that I liked. Added a little bit of roughness, just a touch, 385. Fresnel effects diffuse, I usually always turn this off because sometimes it can introduce noise around the edges of things. So for me, Fresnel effects diffuse I usually always have off, but I always have Fresnel on for speck, reflection, and refraction. So moving down the line, specular value of 0.675, we're going to have a much greater spec quality on this wall, but with a bit of roughness and just a touch of that reflectance at normal to bring it back to the face. We want sort of like a satiny finish onto the wall. No reflection and no refraction necessary. So that's the walls. And now let's add in the door and the trim and things like that. Okay. Here we have our white trim, another AI standard shader, just default white values. A touch of speck, a little bit of roughness to let it roll off. Fresnel always, and just a touch of reflection. Enable internal reflections is not necessary. Fresnel, and that's it. So you'll see these things really start to come down like dominoes once you have your sampling set up, your lighting set up, your shaders, especially for a scene like this where there's nothing, really sort of hand painted or custom textures. It's all just sort of procedural shaders. Once you start attaching shaders, it's just your scene comes together ridiculously fast. Okay, so that's our trim. Now let's add this rug here. Okay, and again, that's just a color map attached to the color channel with a lot of roughness because it's sort of a fabric-y rug. It's not going to have really any sort of specular reflective qualities, but you want that light to rake across the surface. That's where you add just a little bit of roughness. Okay, and again, like I said, no speck, no reflection, no refraction required. Now moving on to the couch itself. Okay. And now for our couch, we do have something a little bit different than what we've touched on so far. And that being that there is a bit of subsurface scattering that I've attached to this shader. Now the color is black, a little bit of roughness. The specular quality, I didn't want it to be a pure white. I wanted it to have a little bit more of sort of a gray fall off that like a leather couch would have, with a bit of roughness. Fresnel as always. Reflection, not really necessary. Refraction, not necessary. But subsurface scattering. Now, I want just a touch of a grayer nature as the hotter light comes and hits and spreads throughout the medium. Leather is skin, essentially, so the same way that a human skin has subsurface scattering, there will be a bit of subsurface for your leathers and things like that. So just a touch of color, a little bit of weight, and a small amount of radius, and it really sort of brings the couch to life. And again, I'm moving a little bit quicker through this section because all of these values are arbitrary. It matters what you need your scene to be and what you want your shaders to be. It's just the important things to glean from this information is, things like always have Fresnel if you want to be physically based, and just understand how things like roughness can affect the way that the light falls off. Without roughness, you get a much tighter spec hit. With roughness, it spreads out across the surface. Okay, so our leather shader is attached. Now we have a couple of extra little couch cushions here. And for this, it's just a very simple color shader, but I used a checkerboard, and with the repeat U and V, I put the repeat to 0 and repeat to 4 to give that stripe that goes completely around the surface of the pillows. Okay, moving on. Let's select all of our objects that are chrome in nature. So the base of the couch, these little legs of the couch, the base of this table, the neck of this lamp, they're all going to be chrome. So touch our chrome shader. Now for a chrome shader, much like glass, you set the diffuse all the way to black, pump up your spec with Fresnel, pump up your reflection with Fresnel, and for metal, things like that, I like to use a higher IOR. Roughness not necessary. Fresnel uses IOR. And no subsurface scattering. Okay, and so that's our chrome. And now we have just a little bit of glass here on these tabletops. Glass table. Pump that in. And now, as you remember from our glass windows, we need to turn off opaque on these glass objects. So select the object, and in the Arnold tab, turn off opaque. And that will allow the light to shine through, and we can see through our objects as well. Okay, now in the home stretch, we've got this little glass cup here. Again, turn off opaque. And here's our cup. And now here's something that we haven't covered as of yet. In the refraction tab, you never want to color or tint your light by using the diffuse. As we've said before, with glass or chrome, always take your diffuse down to black. If you want to introduce color into your cups or your glass or things like that, you do it here on the refraction color. And then transmittance is something that's important, where glass folds in on itself or has a thicker density. A slightly more saturated transmittance than the color will give you those sort of accumulations of color within your glass. Okay, let's attach what I think is our last shader, just a simple lampshade. Alright, there's our lampshade, and that is our scene recreated. We have our shaders all attached. We've covered all of the relationships of the shaders and their values. We've covered our light system for GI with our skydome light, our sky shader to see what our skydome light is sending out to us. We have our lights, area lights shining into the scene. We've covered area lights and their settings. We've covered that glass needs to have opaque turned off. Okay, so here's our scene again, fully rendered. And you'll see that we have some nice things like some caustic light coming through our glass, hitting on the floor, nice specular roll off, got our bump, all of those things. And so that's basically it. That's your crash course on Arnold. Let's go through and touch on our settings one more time as a refresher. Camera settings, or camera samples, important for motion blur, depth of field. It's a multiplier for everything beneath it. Our final production quality settings that we ran with on this particular scene was a value of 8, 3, 3, 2, 2. And again, 8 times 8 times 3 times 3 equals 576. That's the math you need to know. Ray depth, environment. This is where we have our skydome, sky shader that correlates to our skydome light. Our gamma correction. Now textures, this was one thing that I mentioned that we're going to need to understand. You will save a ton of time by using the .tx format instead of just your standard images that you've created in Mari or brought in off the web. And how do you create .tx textures? Well, first thing you need to do is in your render tabs, click Use Existing TX Textures, and then come up here to the Arnold tab and go TX Manager, and then do Select Untitled. And what that's going to do is go through all of the images that you have mapped into your scene and select the ones that are not already in a .tx format, and then all you have to do is hit create.tx, and it goes through and it converts that. Now this is basically the same process that an IMF copy will do to create tiled EXRs in Mental Ray, or that the image to tiled EXR function in V-Ray, creating mapped tiled images for more render efficient renders, so that at render time the images are called up in a more efficient way into your RAM. It speeds up render time enormously. Converting everything to .tx and using the .tx format will on average reduce your render times by anywhere of 30 to 40%. You're crazy to not use the .tx format with Arnold. So that's how you do that. Once you're done building your scene, Arnold TX Manager, select Untiled, create, and that's it. Super simple. Okay, so we've covered our samples, we've covered our system tab. AOVs, I'll have additional training down the line for this, but just a quick overview. We have essentially all AI standards in our scene. This is where you add your direct diffuse, direct spec, indirect diffuse, indirect spec, reflection, refraction, and subsurface. All of these added together in Nuke will bring us back to our beauty image. Now also in the built-in, you can do normals pass, world position pass, z-depth. This is where you attach your z-depth channel and beauty. So go ahead and add those as well. And what that does is it creates this stack here, and this is all of your renderable passes. AOVs, arbitrary output variables, are what they're called in Arnold. It's the same thing as your multipass EXRs for V-Ray or Mental Ray. Okay, so that is our Arnold renderer, the math that we need to remember, our AOVs and how to attach them, and then on our lights, remember, never use intensity, always use exposure. Use color temperature as opposed to picking a color. You can choose from disc, quad, or cylinder for your area lights. Your samples to increase the quality of your render from the light, you attach that here. And when using area lights that you want to scale, uncheck normalize. That will increase the amount of light proportional to the size of your area light. Okay, and again, affect volumetrics, cast volumetric shadows, and volume samples. These are all only relevant for Maya volume fluids, and these two are relevant to Maya scatter, volumetric scatter. Okay, and sky dome shape, same thing. Intensity, resolution. Resolution corresponds to the size of your HDR map, or you can use color temperature. Lat long, exposure, samples. Again, you can leave normalize on for your skydome. On our individual objects, there's our Arnold tab. Opaque must be off for all glass and transparent surfaces. And then subdivision, Cat Clark, iteration set to 3, and you'll be good. That is the equivalent to a mental ray subdivision approximation node, or hitting 3 on an object in V-Ray using render subdivision surfaces. Now, one last bit of business I want to cover before we wrap things up. I can't impress upon you how important it is to be mindful of your sample settings and how they correlate to your render times with Arnold. Here I have 3 images from the same scene that were all rendered with different sample values, but there is a wide range of difference in terms of render time. This first image rendered in roughly 6 hours, second image rendered in roughly 9 hours, and the third image rendered in 25 hours. And now, what accounts for that? Essentially, it all comes down to sample settings and the way that you balance them out. The fastest render, which has the most noise, if you look A to B, fastest render, 6 hours, 9 hours. 6 hours, 9 hours. You'll see that there's some noise around the edges. There's additional noise around here. This pass would not be acceptable, but it had a sample breakdown of 3 camera samples, 6 and 6 for diffuse and glossy, and then 3 and 2. Now conversely, this one that took 9 hours had 8 camera samples with 3 diffuse, 3 glossy, and then 2 and 2. Now, for quality, this ratio is going to wind up being optimal. It's the best balance between smoothing things out and having a fast render. Granted, an additional 3 hours per frame can be, daunting, but an extra 3 hours versus an extra, 20 hours is a huge difference. And you'll see here, this is the 9 hour, and then this is the 25 hour. They're virtually identical. There was just one extra bounce of light on the 25 hour one, but the aliasing, if I can come in close here, is virtually indistinguishable. 9 hours, there's a little bit of extra noise in this spec here versus the 25 hour, 9 hour, 25 hour, but the difference in time is not worth that extra little, 5 to 10% of aliasing quality. And now the settings for this 25 hour render was essentially, it was 6 camera samples and then 6 glossy and diffuse. So you gotta be careful when you're setting your sample settings and be as crafty as you can be and find that balance. It'll make a huge difference. So try and bracket as much as you can before you set off your render. You definitely don't want to wait for this whole render to finish when it was at 25 hours. You kind of want to know that on a single per frame basis. So again, looking at the different sample rates and the breakdown, you have to choose what you can live with in terms of noise quality versus speed. Again, 6 hours, 9 hours, 25 hours. 9 hours and 25 hours are virtually indistinguishable, but the jump between the 6 hour render and the 9 hour render was huge in terms of quality. So for this particular scene, 9 hours at HD is what it's going to cost. So just wanted to, run by that one more time and just make sure that you understand that increasing those camera samples and that multiplier, it can take your scene from a matter of hours to tens of hours with just one little tick up in that camera sample. So be mindful of that. That's basically everything you need to know day one to get you rendering in Arnold. And I hope this video was useful. Please follow us on Twitter at the Max Depth or at Facebook Max Depth VFX. And we'll see you for the next one. Thanks.